Throughout the entire history of the league, there's only been a total of 459 players that have had the honor to be selected for the NBA's All-Star roster. And with a total of around 4,800 players that have been through the NBA, that means you have about a 1 in 10 chance of making one of those teams. There's the multi-time All-Stars that everyone's familiar with, your LeBrons, Kobe's, and MJ's, but for every single franchise, there's at least one player that outperformed expectations for just one single season, and ultimately because of that had the privilege of being one of those lucky 459 players to suit up for an All-Star game. Unfortunately, however, those players usually only receive their flowers from their team's core fan base. Well, today, I'm going to look through every single NBA franchise, find those hidden gems, and give them their proper dues for achieving a feat that under 10% of NBA players have ever had the chance to experience. There's not too many rules we have to go over for this list, the only one being that they must have been selected to an All-Star team at least once. So for example, although that Linsanity run for the Knicks was really hype, it never resulted in him making an All-Star team, so he won't be the person I mentioned for the Knicks. And also, just an FYI, these aren't ranked in any specific order. So with that out of the way, let's just dive right into the list. Starting things off with the Toronto Raptors and Antonio Davis. Antonio got to Toronto relatively early on after the team's debut season, and it didn't take long before he started impacting that squad, getting his only All-Star selection in just his second year, as he was second in scoring for that Raptors squad behind Vince Carter while also leading that 5th-seeded Raptors team in rebounding. His selection also probably got a boost due to the Vancouver Grizzlies looking like they were going to crumble while the Raptors were still successful. So the league most likely wanted to use this as an opportunity to showcase one of their success stories in the North. For the Timberwolves, we have Tom Gugliotta. For his entire career, Tom seemed like he was just one season away from truly taking that next step to becoming a star in the NBA. But teams seemingly weren't willing to wait for that to happen. So he got passed around to a few different teams before finally ending up in Minnesota, and after a year of adjustments with then rookie Kevin Garnett, he was named to the All-Star team. But unfortunately for Tom, that rookie would soon go on to be an MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, an NBA champion, and the guy who was gonna replace Tom the second his contract was up. And really, that's where Tom would peak, as he would spend the rest of his career fighting for minutes on various different teams. Next up is the Denver Nuggets and Antonio McDyess. Antonio is honestly one of the bigger what-if stories in the NBA. He came into the league as the second overall pick and showed massive potential early on. He was always seen as a crazy athlete, and really he was perfect for his era of basketball. And after only 4 seasons, he was able to get his averages up to 21 and 11 with 2.3 blocks a game. Then shortly after that, he'd have his All-Star season. But sadly, entering training camp for the following season, he'd rupture his patella tendon in his left knee, then he'd try to come back early, re-injuring it, and his explosiveness would never return. Now we have the Utah Jazz and Mehmet Okur. Mehmet was really ahead of his time, a stretch big while being a clutch shooter. Think a much toned down Nikola Jokic, but with absolutely zero passing ability. And I gotta say, it does help a little that he looks exactly like every single person from Utah that you've ever met. Now we have the Nets and Kenyon Martin. Kenyon is largely considered one of the greatest dunkers of all time, but the fact that he was also one of the league's best defenders during his prime goes underappreciated at times. He was an essential part of that Nets core that would go on to reach the finals, and definitely a player that is beloved throughout New Jersey. Now we have the Portland Trailblazers and Steve Johnson. Steve was a consistent role player coming off the bench, but for his 2 seasons in Portland, he played alongside guys like Clyde Drexler, Kiki Vandeweghe, and Terry Porter. And so there was pretty much zero attention being paid to him by opposing teams' defense for the entire season. And that led to him overperforming and actually leading the league in field goal percentage for that season due to this fact. Next up is the Golden State Warriors with Joe Barry Carroll. After coming into the league as the #1 overall pick in 1980, Joe got off to a hot start in his career. But thanks to a contract dispute after the 84 season, Joe decided that he'd rather go play a season in Italy. He would come back, and only 1 season later would eventually be named as an All-Star. And if you don't know Joe Barry Carroll, you'd think that this is where he would capitalize on his position, but if you've ever heard of him and his nickname, Joe Barely Cares, well, this is where he got it from, as he really stopped caring after this point in his career. Now we have the Clippers and Chris Kaman. Chris unfortunately struggled with injuries for pretty much his entire career, but all the stars aligned for that 2009-2010 season. He was finally relatively healthy, the team was coming together, and ultimately this led to his All-Star selection. But as a slower center, it wouldn't take long after that before Steph Curry came into the NBA and kind of made players like him much less relevant. Now we have the Los Angeles Lakers and Norm Nixon. Norm played alongside one of the greatest passers in the game, Magic Johnson, and still managed to carve out a role for himself as a smaller guard throwing dimes. So that within itself is impressive enough, but almost understandably, he often gets overshadowed by Kareem and Magic. But his time in LA should never be overlooked. Next up is the Thunder, or the Seattle Supersonics, with Dale Ellis. Dale came to Seattle for the 86-87 season, and immediately went from a player who was averaging 8 points a game in his first 3 seasons, all the way up to 25 points a game in his first season with the Supersonics. He would go on to carry on that hot streak over his 6.5 seasons in Seattle, eventually getting selected to the All-Star team after averaging 27.5 in the 88-89 season. But the Supersonics would ultimately choose to move in a different direction after hitting on younger players in the draft like Gary Payton, and so a 29-year-old Ellis was off to the Bucks and would struggle to find that confidence again as he would drop back down to 15 a game in his 3 seasons with Milwaukee. Now moving on to the Washington Wizards and Jeff Malone. Jeff was the leading scorer for those mid-80s Bullets teams that were a real threat and a consistent playoff run team. But although Jeff was a really solid player, he was more of a catch-and-shoot kind of guy rather than one that was going to go out there and create his own shot. And so he only ever really got those 2 All-Star selections, despite being a guy that would average 19 points per game over his entire career. Now on to the Grizzlies and Marc Gasol. I don't really feel good about this one, but he's really the only player that somewhat fits the criteria for this list. If you guys can think of anyone else in the comments, please feel free to let me know. The next best thing would be Sharif, who probably should have made an All-Star team a time or two while he was with the Grizzlies in Vancouver, but he never did, and ultimately it wasn't until his first season away from the Grizzlies where he picked up his first and only All-Star selection with the Hawks. So Marc Gasol it is, I guess. Now for the Dallas Mavericks and Josh Howard. Josh helped lead that 06-07 Mavs team as their second leading scorer to the top record in the NBA of 67-15. He would stay pretty consistent for the next following seasons, but thanks to a downgrade in a role from the Mavs and an eventual trade to the Wizards, he struggled to find that same relevance and ultimately was out of the league 6 years after making the All-Star team. Now for the Hornets and Jamal Marshburn. For a guy who almost averaged 20 points a game for his entire career, it's a little surprising that Jamal's only real accolades is this one single All-Star selection, finishing third in the Rookie of the Year race during the 93-94 season, and an All-NBA third team the same year as the All-Star selection. But unfortunately, only a season after he made the All-Star team, Jamal would sustain a cartilage issue in his right knee that would refuse to heal properly, and he was ultimately out of the league at 32 years old. Now for the Orlando Magic and Jameer Nelson. He had one season where it seemed like he could fully develop into a reliable scorer, a solid player, honestly kind of playing like a miniature Chauncey Billups, undersized on defense but still physical enough to battle through those screens. But Jameer was never really able to put it all together for a consistent streak. Now for the Houston Rockets and Otis Thorpe. Otis spent his prime alongside Hakeem and therefore didn't get as much recognition, but he was known amongst fans as the guy that went out there and did the dirty work, cleaning up 3.5 offensive rebounds for that All-Star season. He was also a massive contributor to that Rockets 94 championship win. Now for the Celtics and Reggie Lewis. Reggie had a really smooth, clean game and was really fun to watch, a mid-range assassin and one of the better two-way players from his era. He was set to lead the Celtics into the next era post-Bird, but unfortunately passed away just at the age of 27 after suffering an issue with his heart during an off-season practice with the Celtics. Now for the New York Knicks, and we have David Lee. Great offensive rebounder and a hell of a work ethic that brought him from a relatively unknown player to a 2-time All-Star and one of the only bright spots for those horrible Knicks teams before Melo arrived. But unfortunately, you can be the hardest worker in the league, but you can't avoid it if injuries ultimately slow you down and preventing you from reaching any higher levels. Now on to the Indiana Pacers with Rick Smits. An undisputed Pacers legend, was with the team throughout that entire 90s run that saw them reach the Eastern Conference Finals a couple times, and eventually the NBA Finals in 2000. But for how beloved Rick was in the city of Indiana, this was his only All-Star selection. Now for the Milwaukee Bucks and Vin Baker. Vin had a great 4-year stretch with the Bucks, dominated in the low post, smooth touch, and a local Milwaukee hero. But he struggled with addiction issues that would plague his career, and he would never gain these same heights that he found in Milwaukee. However, since then he has went on to create multiple addiction treatment centers throughout Milwaukee, part of the reason why he is such a Milwaukee hero. Now for the Detroit Pistons and Jerry Stackhouse. Not really a deep cut, as most likely everyone watching this knows who he is. I mean, we are talking about a guy who's less than a half point away from averaging 30 on a season. But he was only ever able to average more than 20 points per game 4 other times for his career. And so he only ever made 2 All-Star rosters throughout that time. Next up is the Atlanta Hawks and Jeff Teague. Jeff Teague's a solid player. I like Jeff Teague, but he has no business attending an All-Star weekend even as a fan. But anyone who remembers those Atlanta Hawks teams know that it was a massive team effort from all of those guys that resulted in dudes like Kyle Korver, Paul Millsap, and Al Horford squeezing a few All-Star appearances themselves. Now for the Chicago Bulls and Luol Deng. Luol had those 2 outlier All-Star years, most likely because he was one of the best 5 players on a team coached by Tom Thibodeau. So naturally, he averaged a career high 40 minutes a game over those 2 seasons, drastically boosting his stats. Next up is Goran Dragic. Often seen as a Heat legend in his own right, but he only ever had this first and only All-Star appearance while leading that overperforming Heat team to the finals as D. Wade was winding down his career. Next up is the Cavs and Terrell Brandon. Terrell helped that team through the post-Mark Price era into the LeBron era. He didn't have a long tenure with the team, but he really did hold it down for the city of Cleveland over those 2 seasons. Next up is the Kings with Otis Birdsong. Otis, during his time, was a mid-range assassin, but out of all of the former Kings players, he doesn't really get the love that he probably should from his early years with the team. Next up is the Phoenix Suns and Jeff Hornacek. Definitely not a forgotten player, but it's kind of surprising for how well known he is. His only real personal accolade is this one single All-Star selection. Now we got the Spurs and John Beasley. An ABA player here, starting off his career hot in his rookie season, leading the team in rebounding and being second in scoring. Unfortunately, he was never able to regain that strength that he had through his first 3 seasons and was eventually out of the NBA at the age of 29. The 76ers, we have Andre Iguodala. Definitely not an unknown name either, but for all those other accolades Iggy was able to stack up over his career, this was really his only All-Star nod. And finally, we have the New Orleans Pelicans. And with this being a newer franchise, honestly, there's not many total All-Stars that they've had, let alone ones that would actually fit this bill. And that's the end of the list. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe, like, comment, all that good stuff.